Hello.
Hey, Steve.
Hey, how are you?
Good, sir.
I thought I had a call in, but I actually reached the destination quicker.
Oh, excellent.
I'm down at the newspaper in Mississippi. How do these meetings start? You just generally open it, or?
However, usually Daniel just rolls right through a case study or something.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not doing a case study.
So, and I think we got, yeah, do however you want to go, but we can jump in. We get Shafiq, Tim, Mike.
Okay.
It's 4 after, 5 after. I think we jump in.
All right. Do you want me to start, or do you intro it?
No, go ahead.
Okay. All right, everyone. Welcome. I'm Steve Carvelli. I'm one of the compliance team here at RE/MAX. I'm filling in for Dan today in the Maryland and Pennsylvania talk because I'm licensed in both states. So today I'm going to shift it up a little bit into something that I've seen a lot of conversation about, especially on commission websites, and it's about confidentiality. So today we're going to talk a little bit about classified info, what it is, who you're supposed to tell, what you're supposed to keep. And what's interesting about confidentiality, it's one of the two features of agency that survive a contract and or a transaction. So of all the features of agency, only two survive a transaction, which means last longer than a transaction, or when a listing expires, when a contract ends. It's accounting and confidentiality. Accounting is rather straightforward. Confidentiality is not. And it's probably the most integral part of agency. So we have to know what we can disclose and not to disclose. The normal rule when I've had these calls before, especially on the Tuesday nights call, I used to say, when in doubt, disclose. However, with this aspect of confidentiality, it's when in doubt, you do not disclose. And it generally is the opposite equation that what I generally tell you in regards to material defects. Confidentiality applies to many aspects, except the material representations about the property. So you cannot disclose, you have to disclose material misrepresentations and material representations, but not disclose confidentiality representations. So let's go over what's kind of covered by agency, what's covered by material disclosure, and so forth. One of the interesting aspects is credit reporting. And I go over this with agents every quarter, and it goes over and over again. When you get a credit report from a third party, and it could be for a rental, it could be for a sale, it could be part of a buyer package. Technically, by law, because we are not a credit reporting agency, we are not allowed to disclose any aspect of a credit report, which means credit score, collection accounts, satisfactory accounts, and so forth. The only thing we're allowed to disclose is that if the credit report is acceptable or not acceptable. Now, a lot of people use the term satisfactory or not satisfactory, but since that is a term that's on the credit report and how they analyze credit scores and credit pay histories, probably acceptable, not acceptable, or better. You cannot even tell the person that the credit report is pulled on what their credit score is. Now, is it done? Absolutely. Is it done a majority of the time? Absolutely. But technically, on a very technical point, it is not allowed to be done. It is certainly not allowed to be given to third parties. So if you got a third party credit report that came in and you want to give it to the other side agent or something like that, in regards to a rental, it is not allowed to be sent, conveyed, discussed, or otherwise transported to another party. So that is really against the law. But anything you tell to anything about a credit report is generally a violation. And it's not because of agency, it's because of the credit reporting laws. So be careful with that. It's very rare that people get written up over that. However, if you have a disgruntled tenant who somehow feels that they were slighted or not getting a property, somehow and sometimes they pull on the credit reporting aspect as a basis of complaint, and that is a basis of complaint. So do not discuss scores, collections, only if it's acceptable or not acceptable. Confidentiality also does not extend to illegal positions or actions by any client or customer. So if you have a seller who tells you not to show the house to families and keep it confidential, you don't have to keep it confidential. Well, who are you going to tell? You're going to tell the seller not to do that. But you can also technically, if you have a buyer agent who came to you with a family and were denied access, the seller said, I'm not showing it to them. You could technically tell the buyer agent that the seller was behaving contrary to fair housing, and you inform the seller of that. Technically, you can do that. Probably would you? You probably would not, but that is a disclosable aspect, even though the seller asked you to keep it confidential. If you're a buyer, you're also not to disclose a potential lawsuit. For instance, let's say the buyer tells you that he happened to be in a car accident, and the car accident is he happens to know that he's going to be sued over it. He may have insurance, but perhaps the claim is going to be above insurance. The buyer says keep it confidential. This is an interesting thing because it is a potential lawsuit. It is a potential material fact that goes against the buyer's capability of buying the house. And this is something you have to be very careful of, because when does potential turn into material? So if it looks like he shows you an accident report and he says, look, I am going to be sued. I'm going to be sued above my limits on my insurance, and that's going to affect my assets. It's now material, even though he asked you to keep it confidential. So be careful with that. This is a question you should ask all buyers in their buyer profile. Do you know of any potential lawsuits that may be coming your way? It has been certain case studies and certain commissions in which the buyer agent did not ask that question. A lawsuit came in. It affected their ability to make the down payment and the additional closing money, especially on new construction. And the buyer defaulted on the agreement because he couldn't go through with it. The seller pushed it, and the seller found out about the lawsuit, and the seller found out that the buyer agent did not ask about potential lawsuits. So when you interview your buyers, ask about any potential lawsuits or potential litigation expenses that may be coming down the pike. Sellers can also, quote, classify, unquote, offers and details of offers. Now, you don't have to discuss the number of offers. You can also not have to discuss the details of the offers. Of course, you can't discuss the price of offers, but the seller can limit conversation in regards to offers. Is it material? It is material. However, the seller has control over that material fact. So a lot of times confidentiality frequently collides with certain other aspects of agency, namely honesty and loyalty to the client. This is common. This is where it gets very confusing. You cannot discuss the motivation of a client. You cannot discuss why a client is moving or not moving or buying or not buying. However, and it has to be protected even beyond the transaction. So if you lose a listing and the listing expires and you happen to be at a conference or a luncheon and another broker comes to you and says, hey, what about that listing that expired? Tell me the details about the seller. The only thing you are allowed to state is when the listing expired. That is it. You cannot say anything about the seller. You cannot say anything about the number of offers you got or what kind of activity you got. The only thing you're allowed to state is that the listing expired on such and such a date. All other information is considered confidential, surviving the listing contract. Now, there is a combination that motivation somehow borders on material. Let's say that the seller is actually moving because the neighbor has a dog that barks every 5 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock in the morning every day of the week. That seems to be a material fact that wouldn't be confidential, and that would be going into the seller's motivation. This is a very gray area. Some people consider it material, some people consider it motivation and consider confidential. The only good thing about it is that dogs don't live forever. And perhaps the buyer has dogs and this is not going to be a big issue. But this is a very fine line because I see it as material, because it would be a material fact to me. I would probably make a decision of not to buy that house over a neighbor that really doesn't care about dogs and leaving them out. If the issue is that the dog's not going to live forever, they're going to get another dog and another dog. So it's kind of a repetitive fact. But the people, when it comes to motivation, because it is not an issue about their family, that they're not getting another job or divorce, and it's not about money, that it's considered a motivational aspect that still should be protected and never goes to material. But that is a gray area, especially when people's motivation concerns the neighbors and why they're moving. Generally, it's another reason beyond that, and we always kind of couch the neighbor issue with the other reason. So this is something you have to be very careful of because I think it is a very gray area. Confidentiality also applies to financial considerations, buyer profile sheets, buyer approval letters, technically are confidential unless the buyer explicitly tells you you can send it over. Now, if a buyer completes the form and you're interviewing the buyer, there is an implied consent that needs to go out to other agents. That's how they're going to get approved for the offer. That's how they're going to get accepted for the lease. So generally, that is an acceptance measure that goes into approval. So again, they can be considered confidential. So if a buyer says, I'm giving you information on my bank account that cannot be disclosed, it cannot be disclosed. You can tell the other agent, I have bank account information. It seems to be sufficient for the transaction at hand. And that's how you get around if the buyer imposes a confidentiality issue. Everything always goes on what's imposed as confidential. It is generally a request by a client or customer. It doesn't have to be explicit. It can be implied. But if it's an explicit request, it has to be honored. One of the exceptions is mortgage declinations or a mortgage decline letter. Most contracts will state that if you have a mortgage decline, the other party may be allowed to see it or review it to make sure it is technically declined and it is not declined because of a non-fulfillment of a commitment issue. So mortgage declinations, even though it's personal confidential information from the buyer, generally is considered a material fact and has to be disclosed, even if the buyer asks that the mortgage decline not be sent to the other party. Most contracts have a provision that a mortgage declination can be asked for and can be provided. Because it is paramount to a contract, in other words, the seller is relying on that mortgage decline to refund the earnest money and terminate the agreement. That's why it is a material fact. Appraisals, the same issue. Appraisals are owned by the bank. They are not owned by the buyer who pays for them. If a seller gets another one, if a seller gets one, the buyer gets one, they are not owned by those parties. They are owned by the bank. Appraisals are material. However, appraisals are considered confidential. Home inspections. This is something that everyone falls into. Home inspections, even though they are paid by a client, paid by a buyer, and sometimes a seller, they are not considered confidential because they provide material defects of a property. Home inspections survive a transaction. Home inspections survive a listing. If you have it and it is known, it is material and not governed under confidentiality rules. So in short, confidentiality is probably the biggest component of agency that is misunderstood. It is the component of agency that gets a lot of agents in trouble. And it is a component of agency in which clients and customers alike use as a crux to file complaints and move into bigger and more substantive issues. So be careful with confidentiality. When in doubt, when it comes to confidentiality, you do not disclose. It's the exact opposite of material facts. Material defects, when in doubt, you disclose. Confidentiality, when in doubt, you do not disclose. That's it. Any questions, comments, suggestions, opinions, ideas, complaints?
None from me, Steve. I think the last part's pretty clear. You know, confidential. If it's confidential, err on not disclosing, and if it's material, err on disclosing. But that was a helpful refresher, so thank you.
No problem. Everyone good? How many people do we have on? Do you know?
Looks like 5.
How many should be on?
60.
Okay, you're gonna have to work on that, Andrew.
Hey,
These are regulatory calls.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the people that did join today and listen in. Hopefully they can help be a testament to how short and simple yet protective and important they are. They're 10-minute phone calls. So we'll start here, Steve, and we'll keep getting everybody else involved.
Yeah, I call it.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
This is Mel. I have a question about the dog barking. Is this specific to Maryland? Because I've done some other research on this in Virginia and have always found that no, noise is not material.
Well, let me go back to that.
Yeah,
That's still a gray area. It's not just in Maryland. There's dogs everywhere who cause a problem. But
right. Well,
it goes
dogs or
but
people walking over your head in a condo, that kind of thing.
correct. But the issue they have is that the neighbor is deliberately like putting the dog out. So the
Right.
dog is not the issue. It's the neighbor's actions that may be antagonistic to a buyer. So another example would be, let's say one neighbor is black, one neighbor is white, and they're confronting really on a racial issue, but they're using the dog as the leverage into something higher. So it's not systemic of the dog itself. It's what may be behind the motivation of the dog. You're supposed to disclose any type of violation of a protected class protection. So that would have been, if it was that the reason, then that is a violation and that has to be reported. If it's just a dog that they don't bring in the morning and they don't care, you're right. Then it is not material. But I see it two ways. I see a lot of times that if it's not disclosed and there were motivating factors above and beyond just the dog being out, that you could get in trouble for a non-disclosure of a seller when they told you about it and you did nothing about it, then that seems to be another issue. This is a gray area. I've seen cases go both ways, and they always get into the motivation of why neighbors behave a certain way. Now, the way around it is generally that motivation isn't the only issue that they're moving. It could be, our family's bigger, my job's moving, and by the way, we have an issue, a neighbor who is a racist. So there's always couched in other areas, but yes, you have to be careful with that. You really have to be careful because I've seen commissions work both ways on that.
Okay.
And really, and to be honest with you, because my always interpretation is I may be a buyer with dogs, and that may not bother me at all. And the overriding factor that he's trying to get rid of the people next door by doing it, it may be totally incidental to me because I have 5 dogs coming into his one. So you have to look at the context of the overall transaction and see where it stands. But if that's the only issue that the seller is telling you why they're moving, and I believe that the neighbor is racist and he puts his dog out there to harass us every day, your next question is there a police report? Once there's a police report, it's material. So you have to ask one more question after that.
Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Yep. So just be careful with confidentiality. What's top secret to you and other people, it's generally top secret to the real estate profession. So just be careful and be careful of credit reports. I had a friend of mine who owns a brokerage in Arizona. He just got fined by the Arizona, I think, Department of Consumer Affairs for sending a credit report out to somebody. And that's all he was fined for, sending a credit report out. You cannot send credit reports. So just remember, every once in a while, they clamp down on that. And I don't know if that's the beginning of a phase in this country, but he's the first one in probably 3 or 4 years that I've heard who's actually been fined for doing it. Okay.
Thank you, Steve.
You're welcome, guys. All right. Talk later.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Sure.
All right. Thank you.